So I learned that my badass lightweight racing gauge set right here won't qualify for most SCCA classes because it's too lightweight and it'd give me unfair advantage. So what we're going to be doing today, since it's raining out, is going to be making a new badass gauge cluster so we can hold these badass gauges in so I can see how many horsepower I'm making at all times. First things comes first, since this is an American car, you need to use an American gauge. I like to use this 5/8 gauge measuring gauge, and it'll show you how much you need to do. So that's 1/5/8 gauge measurement right there, and that's how big I'm going to make the gauge cluster. We got this polyethylene solution here that I got from the dumpster at work, so we're going to use this to make our badass gauge cluster out of. Always make sure to peel back the protective layer on the polyethylene solution because it might make you have more weight and you might go over the weight limit for your class. Alright, we got this badass design like a classic HKS gauge pod. We're going to cut this out with my with my plasma cutter right here. Always have to have red go back to power, and black is because I live in an area that uses coal power plants. So we're going to cut this right out. I'm going to go ahead and get this started right now. Now that is badass. Alright, now just make sure to test it in place because this carbon solution can have thermal expansion during the plasma cutting process. So make sure it still fits before you go any further. In my case, it fits perfect. But in your case, you better be careful. Okay. Alright, there was a small incident on one of the parts of the gauge cluster, and I'm going to need to patch it, so I got this badass gauge cluster repair fluid from Nickeltown Customs. What you gotta do is do one part of diethylene, the other part glycol, and you mix it up and you can fix your gauge cluster. Now that is badass. Always make sure to repair your gauge cluster, because if you don't repair the gauge cluster, they may read off and that can affect your performance on the track. Next thing we're going to do is use this high precision gauge cluster sealant diamond paper to clean up the excess gauge cluster sealant. Look at that. Good as new. Okay, next thing we gotta do is cut 2 holes for each of the gauges. Badass. Next thing we're gonna do is hit it with this triacetate priming solution from Nickeltown Customs. That should prime it up for the high temperature paint that we're going to put on afterwards. So I have the oil pressure sensor apart, and with this offcut from the housing, I can make a new gauge face that'll make it a lot easier to see when I'm racing. Now that's badass. So I did a couple more things off camera. I installed these little intention grabbers here to remind me to look at the gauges, so it'd be really helpful when I'm driving on the racetrack. And I put this little shader right here from Summit Racing to remind me to only look at this part of the gauge, because sometimes you end up looking at this part too much. This gauge cluster is so badass, I'm giving it 5 out of 5 Ichiban Moto stickers. Thank you for watching.